Welcome everybody to the Stockholm Free World Forum. I'm very delighted to have you all. My name is Jonsson, I'm director here. Today we are having a very good visit from Australian Strategic Policy Institute, two of their experts. I'm very happy to introduce Tom Uren, who's senior analyst with a background in the Department of Defense. And he has expertise on offensive cyber capabilities, Internet of Things, Chinese espionage, and actually some more things as well, which I will not go into. We also have Danielle, who is the deputy head of ASPI's Cyber Policy Center. Danielle's expertise is in cyberspace, digital technology. She has, among other things, been Google Policy Fellow at Harvard. So today we're going to focus talking on Chinese cyber capabilities in this espionage. Tom and Danielle has a wide-ranging expertise, so don't feel shy when we get to Q&A if you want to talk a bit more about China's tech giants, or if you want to talk about offensive cyber capabilities. The speakers are so graceful that they allowed us to diverge a little bit. But the main topic is a topic that has escaped the attention of few. Last week, Trump called a national emergency in a move that is widely believed to be directed against Huawei to block their entry into the American market. Today, or probably yesterday, you saw that Google stopped its cooperation with Huawei, which means that you cannot access any kind of Google apps anymore on Huawei. The UK Defence Minister Gavin Williamson had to resign, was kicked after an alleged leak of a national security meeting discussing Huawei. So there's absolutely no lack of current hooks, and it's really the ones who will develop 5G will be at the let's say the backbone of the next step in the digital economy. So we're going to proceed like this. Tom is going to start with the initial remarks. Danielle is there to jump in or perhaps cap off. And then we will have a discussion with the audience here. So very welcome, and the floor is yours, Tom. Happy to have you.
Great. Thanks for having us here, Oscar. And it's lovely to see such beautiful weather in Stockholm. Last time I was here, it was very grey, so this is a marked improvement. And thanks very much for coming. So I thought I would start and talk about the broader picture of Chinese interference in Australia. So the Australian intelligence services have said that Chinese intelligence services are, and I quote, up in our face every day. There was a little while ago an Australian senator who resigned because he'd accepted Chinese money and had started parroting the official Chinese line on the South China Sea, in sort of diverging from his party's official line. There's been a tremendous amount of trying to co-opt senior figures. So politicians from both sides of Parliament have accepted really high-paying jobs in Chinese companies after they've left politics. And there's also a lot of, and then there's the background of espionage, cyber-enabled espionage that goes on. So one mining company in Australia, it's been publicly reported that a hack, their confidential negotiating position for iron ore negotiations were stolen, and that resulted in the loss of over $1 billion. So in Australia, $1 billion is still a lot of money, and that's the kind of background to the whole Huawei discussion. People are concerned, especially in the last sort of 3 to 5 years in particular, about that continuous, in what an Australian would call niggle. So stuff that's just picking away and chipping away. So back in 2012, Huawei was banned in Australia for the first time. So we were at the time building or just starting to build a nationwide broadband network that is meant to deliver really fast broadband to all of Australia. So Australia is a very big country. This is a very big project. And in 2012, the then Labor government banned Huawei from what was called the core of the network. So the core contains all the kind of critical stuff that you actually want to protect. So billing, subscriber details, call records, those kinds of details that would be valuable for someone else. So that policy of banning a high-risk vendor, Huawei, from the core of the network basically continued until last year. And it was a default policy. It wasn't really written down anywhere. It was just the kind of thing that telcos knew. Presumably someone told them, I don't know. And at that time, last year, the Australian government introduced and passed some new legislation, the telecommunications sector security reforms. And this legislation actually imposed a security obligation on telcos. So until that time, there was no requirement for telcos to build a secure network. And in fact, if you talk to people in the telco industry, there's not much incentive for telcos to actually be secure. So this legislation had a component that companies had to tell if they were going to had to tell the government if they were going to make a change to a network that might affect security. And it also allowed the government to direct telcos to do particular things to maintain security. So the telcos, knowing that that legislation was coming, didn't want to invest a huge amount in Huawei kit if they had to get it ripped out of their network subsequently. So 2 telcos in Australia, we've got 3 major mobile operators. 2 of them have Huawei in the RAN, the radio access network, not the core, but no one has it in the core of our telco mobile networks. So the telcos were keen for the government to actually make a decision about 5G. Can we use Huawei equipment or not? That really forced the government to think about it long and hard. And it kind of came down to 3 or 4 different things. So there's the background of Chinese cyber espionage. So there's a long history of wide-ranging espionage that's going on all the time, everywhere. So that makes you pretty certain that the Chinese state has the intent to conduct espionage operations. The second part was whether they had the capability to use Huawei in that endeavour, and it's pretty clear that they do. So there's, first of all, the rule of law is not particularly strong in China. So prominent people disappear, full stop. So that makes you worry that if they need to compel Huawei, they can apply a lot of individual pressure on particular people. And now, not only is the rule of law weak, they actually have a law that compels people to assist. So there's a 2017 law that says that individuals, companies, organisations must assist in intelligence collection efforts. So that means that the government definitely has the capability to force Huawei, or just people who work for Huawei. So when you combine intent and capability, then you actually have a threat that you should do something about. So the Australian government looked at different models. One model was the UK model of having risk assessment and trying to reduce the threat by technically assessing it. If you look at the UK oversight reports on that assessment body, they kind of go from bad to worse. So they start out by saying that, look, we're really concerned that Huawei's security isn't very good, but we're working in good faith and we're sure that things will get better over time. And now if you fast forward 6 years later, this is all terrible. Things are bad and they're not getting any better and we don't think we're achieving anything. That's my paraphrasing. The report doesn't actually say that, but it's as close to that as you can get in bureaucratic language. And so from an Australian point of view, it's a terrible idea to think that we can assess our way to risk mitigation. If the UK can't do it in 8 years, why would we think that we could start and do any better? And how long would that take? So that's, to me, that was always a non-starter. And it was a consistent trend. It was never at any point even dipping up. It was just more and more depressing. So the other part of the decision, we've got the capability and in the intent, and I guess actually it's probably the underpinning part, is the 5G network something we care about at all? Because if we don't care, then whatever. But the decision is that 5G is actually pretty important. So it is probably going to underpin our economy, but also many other critical services. So because of the increased reliability and high speeds, high latency, it's probably other critical services will be built on top of 5G. So industrial control systems and perhaps power networks, perhaps. So that means that the 5G network's actually super critical, and when we've got that combination that makes us think that there's a threat, we actually absolutely must do something to mitigate that. So once we've reached that point, then there's a technical discussion about, can we mitigate that threat? One of the worries in 5G is that because of the requirement to be a lot faster, it's much harder to separate functions, because you can't talk to something that exists in the core a long way away and then come back to the edge, so that some of those functions get pushed out. And so our intelligence agencies assess that it's very, very difficult to have to maintain separation and still actually deliver what you would call 5G. And another one of the big concerns is that these are big, important pieces of equipment that have ongoing maintenance contracts. And those mean that there are engineers mucking around in your network all the time who have administrator privileges. So all of a sudden, it's not just worried about the risk of backdoors, but the risk of a Chinese engineer compelled by their government to do something that would be against your interest. So that was, I suppose, the final piece. One of the other things that occurs is that in Australia, it's very, very easy to see that the future with China is not clear. So China is our biggest trading partner. There are, I think, our overseas exports 1, 2, and 3 are all Chinese. There are many, what was I going to say? I totally lost the plot there. No, I'll just stop that. So what we wanted to try and do was, okay, let's go to questions perhaps. I just totally lost.
Talking about the future relationship with China, between Australia and China, but that was unclear.
Oh, yeah. So what I was trying to say is that they're both a trading partner, but it's really easy to come up with a scenario where we're actually in some kind of conflict with them in the not too distant future. So, for example, in the South China Sea, there could be a US transit that results in some sort of war fighting. And there could be some sort of conflict with the US or over Taiwan. And if the US and China were involved in a conflict, it's almost certain that Australia would be asked to assist by the US. We've never ever said no to the US in joining a conflict. So that would be, so in a very short period of time, we could actually be on different sides of a war. And if that's the case, it's inconceivable that China wouldn't try to use Huawei to its advantage. So if it were built deeply into our critical infrastructure, That's not a very happy place to be. Also, from an Australian point of view, we were worried that if right now there's a choice of a couple of vendors in that part of the network. So I think there's Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia, and maybe a few others. And we were worried that if Huawei continued to dominate, there would be no choice of vendor for the next generation of network. So that was also a consideration. So it's really interesting to talk about this issue in Sweden. In Australia, I never really think about the implications for Ericsson or, well, I think about it, but I don't care because they're not Australian companies, right? Whereas I think in a way it makes it much more difficult for you as a country because there's this kind of overlap between espionage and industrial policy that I think is perhaps uncomfortable. That's just my personal opinion on that.
I was just going to jump in to add something on your points, Tom, which was, so Tom and I and a few others at our think tank last year, for the first half of last year, were really heavily involved in this Huawei and 5G debate. And we certainly did not assume that other countries would be going through it afterwards and that we would be sort of called upon to share Australia's experience. I think we were really excited at the end of last year to never talk about Huawei again, and it's just not been possible. But and we spent, Tom and I both worked in the Australian government in various departments and agencies. Now that we're out of government, naturally we spend a lot of time criticising government, and I think that's the way it should be. But actually the 5G decision I thought was a really good and too rare example of really good policy contestability within the government. It was made over a really long period of time. We didn't have Brexit or something else major going on that was soaking up all the oxygen. Actually, this was probably, at the time, the biggest foreign policy security issue the government was focused on. We had a Prime Minister who, of course, we don't like to keep our Prime Ministers for more than a year, so he's long gone now. But at the time, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was really deeply interested in all things cyber and critical technology. So people used to say you'd walk into his office and he'd have a stack, a reading pack this big of just 5G related reading. So there was a huge amount of effort. And across departments and agencies, I don't want to guess how many, but I would assume at least 5, 6 or 7 different departments and agencies, possibly more, put up their own briefings to their ministers on what they thought should happen. And they didn't all land at the same place. I think many got to the point where Huawei is going to be one of a small number of high-risk vendors that we don't want to work with in critical national infrastructure, but a lot of them, I think, got to a place of, let's try this UK approach where we'll focus everything on technical mitigation, or let's find some way to compromise so we don't have to do a sort of complete ban on Huawei. So what I really liked about the debate in Australia was that it traversed the technical and the strategic. And we just come from London and sort of did we wanted to talk about other things, but we almost exclusively ended up talking about Huawei and 5G. But their debate, to me, seems really stuck in the technical. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. They have this evaluation centre that we don't have, and I think once you throw a whole bunch of money and policy towards something, you don't really want to let it go. Australia and the UK have very different strategic outlook positions. For us, China is our biggest trading partner by a mile. Unfortunately, they're also our biggest intelligence adversary. So there's really different complications there. But that's just one thing I wanted to jump in on.
Before we start the Q&A, I'll maybe invite you up, Danielle.
Sure.
And we'll have a mic that we pass around. So introduce yourself and speak into the mic. First, I would just ask really an overarching question. That will be someone, and I don't know if that person wanted to be quoted, but someone who's quite wise said something that if I were an intelligence chief in China's, in the People's Liberation Army or in China's intelligence agencies, I would spend almost a lot of focus on Sweden because it's very, very high technology, but it's also very, very low punishments in political repercussions of trying to get at Sweden. And then, so my question is really, what are your experiences? You have been living with next to rising China for a long time and increasingly assertive. How do you manage to maintain both a cooperative relationship, but also to stop that kind of the cyber espionage or other kind of mischiefs and influence?
To be honest, I don't think we do a very good job. so there's a huge economic dependence on China.
Yeah.
So we export a lot of iron ore, a lot of coal, and education is our third largest export. And at any one time, there's something like 170,000 Chinese students in Australia. So our universities are very dependent, and that for a long period of time has meant that people are really reluctant to say anything. So until, was it last year? China has never officially been named as a culprit for any cyber espionage ever. And what would happen is that in newspapers, people would say it's suspected to be China, but there was never any official acknowledgement. What's happened in the last year in particular is there's much more consistent national security sources say that it was China rather than just someone random. So the signalling to the public has gotten much stronger. We don't, in terms of retribution, like I don't think that exists in cyber. Like there's nothing I think that we have done that has actually deterred China. So what Australia has done is there've been Cloud Hopper. So that is an ongoing Chinese operation to get into managed service providers. So managed service providers do the IT for many, many other organisations. So if you get into a managed service provider, you get access into a whole lot of other companies. So that operation, which PwC, Price Waterhouse, called Cloud Hoppers, has been going on, and I'm pretty sure it was the Australia, US, UK announced that was Chinese state activity. And there was, I think, perhaps one other Chinese one. Can you remember?
No, I think it's only been one.
Yeah, okay. So just the once, ever.
But we've attributed Russia for a whole bunch of activities that didn't occur in Australia. So there's been this real disconnect, I think.
So you've shown that you are good at attribution.
Yeah, we can attribute.
We can attribute when it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think to your point on the Australia-China relationship, personally, I think it's never going to be in a positive place again like it was 6 years ago when we just thought of it and saw it as economic opportunity. And, you know, besides some of the security agencies, everybody else just saw this as, you know, it's all about economics, it's all positive. This is going to be fantastic for the Australian economy, and in many ways it has been. But I think actually the challenge for future Australian governments, and I think they're starting to get their head around this, is we have to normalise everyone to the fact that this isn't going to be, we're never going to be allies with China. This is going to be a really complicated relationship forever under the Communist Party. We have different norms, different values. You know, when you're working with a large Chinese technology or telecommunications company, you're not working with a strictly commercial actor, you're working with an actor who has to participate in intelligence collection, who has hundreds of Communist Party branches within the company, and whether they like it or not, and I suspect many don't, have to have these really compulsory strong links to the Communist Party. And that makes it very different, I think, to how a lot of the rest of the world operates in a business sense. So I think that relationship is going to continue to be, we've been in the freezer now, people say, for 5 years. And when Canada has gone through its difficult time, I think that took some of the attention away from us. So I think we're going to always be in this medium space where we're going to try to promote the positives, but we can't sort of ignore the negatives anymore.
Okay, let's open up the floor. So we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Mikael Törnvall with Svenska Dagbladet, a Swedish newspaper. What I'm trying to understand is, what do you and maybe New Zealand see that nobody else can see? Because you're the only one that followed the US demands for a boycott, and you see Germany doesn't do it, UK doesn't do it, Sweden certainly doesn't do it. What do you see that the rest of the world doesn't see?
We see risk, is what I would say. And so, to be clear, the UK still hasn't made a decision. At least that's what everyone tells us.
And New Zealand's also banned Huawei equipment in a lot of...
Yeah, and also Vietnam, and is it the Czech Republic or somewhere else? Anyway, I think the thing is, what is, and I was trying to explain earlier and probably didn't do a very good job, is that our future relationship with China is uncertain. And at least with the, say, the Finns or the Swedes or the Americans, I mean, sure, there's uncertainty in any relationship, but it's very, 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 very difficult to imagine us talking about you guys as adversaries, whereas that's entirely possible with China within a relatively short period of time. And information technology is just so complex that if you're in an adversarial position, I think it's impossible to really get the what I would call the warm fuzzies, feel reassured that the security is what you require when you're putting things into your critical infrastructure. So I think that is the real difference. It's the assessment of the relationship going forward, and it's just uncertain. So you can imagine a world where Xi Jinping turns around and says, well, actually, I don't want to be in charge for life, and I can sort of let go of the my crushing control, and things can be a bit more normal. That could happen, but it's also entirely possible that Xi Jinping doubles down and it becomes more authoritarian than ever, and that control is extended. And I think that is the real worry. So I think people tend to think too much that it's about the bits and bobs in your network, and it's much more about guaranteeing the security of your network in the future going forward.
So do we think that geography is the kind of determinant factor? Because I mean, the UK has also always joined the American interventions.
I think that's one factor. So, like I said, it's very easy in Australia to come up with a scenario that has us literally at war with China. It's easy in the US to do that. It's more difficult in the UK. So maybe that means you can accept more risk. The UK also has Huawei much more deeply in its networks. So that means it's costlier to try and change policy. We were fortunate that we had that policy for, 7 years now. So we're in a better place to begin with.
Okay. Let's go on. Next question here. David?
Thank you for an interesting remark. My name is David. I'm a program manager for defense policy at Folkförsvar. Could you please reflect a little bit on the economical impacts on Huawei if a large part of the Western world will ban or partially ban Huawei in their networks?
I'm not an economist. I think it's going to be very difficult with the ban in the US and putting it on the entity list. So that kind of undercuts some of their supply chain. It's not clear to me how much of an impact that has, but certainly for ZTE, that same move kind of almost shut them down overnight. So my understanding is Huawei is in a better position. Before that announcement, I thought that Huawei would have kind of portions of the world, large portions of the world, and that other vendors would have other portions. But now I'm a bit more pessimistic about their future.
Yeah.
I think US technology is still number one.
I think Huawei is the telecommunications company of choice across many developing regions, and almost always that entry into that market is funded by a China Exim Bank loan, which makes it pretty easy when you're going into countries in Africa and you're getting $300 million to set up an e-governance network or a broadband network or increasingly smart cities. And I also would have said until the entity list issue, they were going to be fine, that you will just have a suite of countries who care about security will ban Huawei from their 5G critical infrastructure projects. But in Australia, Huawei still does tons of good business as we were talking about earlier today, they've been on a charm offensive for the last 2 years. They do a lot of public relations. They sponsor football teams. They have former politicians and military officials on their board. They put in a huge amount of effort. So even though they're banned from the 5G network, they're already banned from the National Broadband Network 6-7 years ago now. But they still provide Wi-Fi for some of our train networks. They give a lot of funding to universities. They're everywhere. But this entity list, I think, changes things quite a lot.
Next, Lars.
I believe I'm the supposedly wise man that you quoted. I used to be Swedish ambassador to China, and the full saying is that I don't think there is any other country in the Western world which has so much advanced technology with possible military applications and unbounded naivete, not punishment. I stress naivete because I think what is needed in the current situation, both with China and Russia, is not just the competent organs taking action, but an awareness in all of society, and that I think is lacking. I would even call it insouciance, a kind of the Alfred E. Neumann-esque aspect of Swedish policy. Us problems? ? I'd like to ask about something called decoupling, a word which came into the China vocabulary about last year. And do you envisage that? Do you envisage a world of AI and 5G, which is dominated by China, particularly by Huawei, and another world which is dominated by the United States, and the rest of us will have to choose?
I don't really like the idea, but it's definitely a possibility. So having China in the global economy has been good for all of us. And I think what is happening is that we're realizing that we took a whole lot of things for granted in terms of being able to trust in what we bought. And it turns out that there's now heaps of examples where it's clear that you can't just trust what you buy because of what it says on the tin. That when you look a bit deeper, there's a whole lot of risks in there that we weren't doing anything to sort of validate and mitigate. So I think we'll end up in a world where we actually spend a lot more time and effort reassuring ourselves that what we buy is what what it says on the tin is actually what we're getting, and that we have more confidence that when we buy something, it will do only what it's meant to do. So in some parts of the supply chain, that will mean decoupling. So there'll be things that are critical that we need to reassure ourselves about that we'll buy from a trusted source. And if you're talking about Sweden having to make a choice, I don't think there is much of a choice to be made. Like, I think all the same arguments that apply to Huawei apply to other parts of the supply chain. So the thing is to assess what is actually important to you, first of all, what's important, and then how do we know that it's secure? And if you can be sure that something from China is secure, then fine, what's the problem? There's no problem. Or if you don't care, that's also fine. So I think that I just don't like decoupling because it seems to presuppose confrontation. And I don't think, I'd be hopeful that we don't get to a point of confrontation, that we can coexist with perhaps friction.
But then the follow-up question. Oh, sorry.
No.
The follow-up question would be: are we not already in a confrontation? And I'm just thinking of events. Only last week we saw a Swedish journalist writing about Taiwan, and the Chinese embassy in Sweden made a long statement saying he was wrong, and that's the factual thing would happen. But then if you look at it and you see, okay, well, now you have the embassy in Sweden really trying to silence people. Don't talk about this. I mean, the symbolism of that is quite strong. Wouldn't that suggest at least some level of intensity in the conflict? And then also to ask the question, what do you think the Australian government would have done to such a statement?
You can answer that one.
I mean, Taiwan gets written about in Australia every week. So, and we have a very large Taiwanese diaspora, and we also have a very large Chinese Australian diaspora as well. So you wouldn't have the embassy or any of the consulates writing about one specific piece, because then they'd have to do it for every piece, and then I think they'd get overloaded. But there is they do apply a lot of pressure. They own almost all the Chinese language media in Australia is directly or indirectly linked and or owned by the Chinese government, state media, except for one newspaper. We have about 1.5 million plus WeChat users in Australia. So one of our biggest problems in this election, which just played out 2 days ago and was quite a shock result, was disinformation on WeChat. It was covered in the media every day. It was a huge problem. No one knew who to talk to. We don't have established links to Tencent, the company that owns WeChat, and it's something we're grappling with. Our Electoral Commission before the election spoke with Facebook, Twitter and Google and said, we want to make sure you guys are on top of fake news, misinformation, disinformation. What are you doing? And they worked quite closely. And Tom and I wrote an article months ago and said, who's talking to Tencent? But I had no idea that it would really blow up over the last month and become such a disinformation problem. But I've sort of half avoided your question. I'll get back to it. So if the Chinese embassy wrote a letter to a newspaper complaining about how someone covered Taiwan, I don't think it would get much attention. I think
you should talk 60 Minutes story.
Oh, yeah. I don't think it would get much attention because we're so used to that every week that people don't take that stuff very seriously anymore. So we had a big 60 Minutes production last year that focused on the Chinese government's influence in the Pacific Island regions, so Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. It focused a lot on Vanuatu and allegations that there was a Chinese loan that was going to a wharf in a very strategic area that essentially was going to be built up as a potential military base. And this sort of topic gets bounced around a lot, and someone senior from the Chinese embassy called up the 60 Minutes producer and said, you will not run this show next week. And the producer said, well, yes, we will. And the individual said, no, you won't. I'm speaking to your leader. You are not running it, full stop. And the producer recorded the conversation, and then they wrote about the encounter that week, which made the embassy look bad. It made them look very coercive, and it also, I think, showed a really deep misunderstanding of how a free media works. I'm sure it's the same here, but our media doesn't listen to our politicians or our government in any way, and are pretty, very sort of free-ranging. So, and that sort of pressure applied to Australian media actually makes it worse. We have a lot of journalists now who have decided that Chinese state interference and influence in Australia is a great calling, and they're basically making a career out of it, which is great, because that's how we get a lot of sort of new information is coming straight out of the media. So I don't think it'd be taken very seriously, essentially.
Did the government put out any statement on that?
The Australian government?
Yeah, on the...
I think politicians were forced to comment on it, and I guess they would have said something like, well, we have a free media, and therefore...
Okay, but nothing more memorable than
No,
that.
it's just, I think this has been going on for so long now that it's just not taken very seriously anymore. I think actually the Chinese government's overplayed their hand a little bit. I think all the day-marching, all of the complaints, the holding up of wine and coal in ports, I think it's getting to the point where it's so much that people don't focus on individual incidents anymore, which may be a good thing.
More questions? Jan?
Thank you. Jan Lehr, yeah, it's my name. I have a question concerning this law from 2017. I've come from intelligence myself, back in the distant past. It seems to me there are a number of question marks, and firstly, it seems quite unnecessary. I have found it very difficult to see Chinese enterprises in this sector who would refuse when intelligence told them. And on top of that, I mean, Huawei was almost from the start regarded as a sort of military intelligence, in fact, run by military intelligence. And at the same time, the leadership or responsible politicians must have realized that this would be a very grave thing, a very, let's say, export threatening thing to do, because then Huawei or any other company cannot say that we will not cooperate with intelligence, of course. So why? Was there any discussion in China or explanation of the law, or Lars perhaps knows something about this? Has there been any discussion on possibility of abolishing the law, for example, or changing it to another more or less harsh form? Okay, that is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so I myself have similar questions, and it seemed like such a counterproductive thing. And apparently it was passed in just a couple of weeks, and the first draft talked about enterprises as well, and that got taken out in the second draft. So there's perhaps like an argument you could make that, well, when they took out, I think it was enterprises, they meant to take out that interpretation is corporations. Now, having said that, I'm not a China expert per se, but I think I'm baffled as to why they enacted that law for the same reason. It seems just like such a terrible PR decision. I think the very short time frame indicates that there was some internal pressure to be perhaps seen to be doing something for God knows what reason. And so I guess the other thing is I've asked people who actually specialize in sort of reading Chinese law and understanding their system of government about it. And because people will maintain, oh, that's not what the law is about, it's about something else. But people who actually study it say all their laws are acting in concert to basically place the Communist Party above all other priorities. So, everything is designed to support the Communist Party. And so that law is just another sort of plank in the edifice of giving it primacy.
And I think that it wasn't just that law. There's a whole suite of counter-espionage and national security laws which essentially say very similar things. But for whatever reason, that 2017 law was just far franker, which I thought was crazy. I thought that was a huge strategic mistake to put it on the internet. But they did so in one place, obviously in Mandarin, and we were the first group in the world publicly to analyse that law in depth, and it took us 6 months to pick it up. And when we picked it up, it was because we had an American visiting fellow, a young woman called Elsa Kenya, who's fantastic, and she was translating it and looking in depth, and we then went, wow, this is a huge deal, let's start looking into this and pushing it out there. So then it got into the American media via us later on. So I couldn't believe that it took, so long for that law. I would have assumed, in-depth China academics who are focused on this every day would have put that out there, but it wasn't the case. So, I don't think they promoted it. I think they put it on one little website and it was very hidden because it was in Mandarin. But yeah, I just thought, I couldn't believe they did that. And it goes to issues like what you said. We don't have a single public example of a Chinese company being able to push back against the government. We have tons of examples in the US and Australia. At the moment, we have that giant Australian Atlassian company having a big fight with our Australian government about encryption and pushing back against things. We don't have any similar examples in China, and that sort of shows that, you can't push back if you have to participate in intelligence. There is no example where Huawei has put up their hand and said, we were asked in Nigeria to take something and we said, no, we're going to bring this public and push back. And I think if anyone in the room has followed the African Union headquarters hack example, where from 2012 to 17, it was alleged first in Le Monde and then confirmed by the Financial Times that every night for 1,800 days, valuable data was stolen and taken to servers in Shanghai. Many months later, we wrote a really in-depth article about that, because what was missed at the time is that Huawei was the key ICT provider for that entire building and wholly responsible for cybersecurity and data protection. So that's I think that's the great example of, let's pretend they had nothing to do, they did not take that data, and let's put that aside. And in Australia, we put that aside because of defamation. But let's just focus on the fact, okay, this data was taken. We have lots of, well, I think, I'm careful because of defamation to say alleged, but we have African Union officials saying it, I have foreign diplomats saying it, we've had Le Monde and the Financial Times confirm that this happened. So either cybersecurity was terrible, or they saw that it was being taken every night and didn't say or do anything about it. And I think that leaves us in a really problematic place.
Another question from Rutger.
I'm Rutger Bamsen. I used to be a sinologist. I used to be a diplomat, and I also used to be a banker. And as a banker, I was in charge of country risk analysis, which also brought me back to China, where I was posted in the mid-70s. I think we have seen this before in the South China Sea. I also think we have seen this in China's, you could call it behavior within the World Trade Organization perimeter. And I think it is that China has never really been part of the Westphalian order of equality between states. And I think here we're talking about a very different concept in which, or a value basis, in which equality is not a perimeter. And I think that is China's Confucian values. We're also seeing a Confucian renaissance, which for me as an old sinologist is abhorrent, considering how Mao Zedong was against everything Confucian. Now we're seeing Xi Jinping stimulating this Confucian renaissance as a way of strengthening the power and influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And the upshot of that is that all Chinese units, individuals and so on, are subservient to the, what you could say is the people's emperor. So I think we are talking about a very different culture in which we don't see any acceptance of the Westphalian order, and that is the basic problem here. Thank you.
Any reactions?
Yeah, that sounds about right. And I guess the sense is that they just are playing on a different playing field than we are. So the presumption of the reason it's difficult to or at least the reason some countries find it difficult to exclude Huawei is because they assume that we're all on the same playing field, but actually they're playing a different game, and so that's the problem.
It kind of brings me on to playing a different game and the tech giants. I want to ask mainly, probably Danielle mostly. I don't think we have reacted that much in the West when our big tech giants own basically everything about us data-wise. Everything in our lives are there, and as long as it's being run by hippies in San Francisco, and I live there, they're super nice people, we don't worry that much. But now we see, I mean, among the Chinese tech giants, they are, I think they're flying a bit under the radar here, but they are huge, they're innovative, and they are giving, let's say, the established tech giants a run for the money. How do you see their kind of growth, and how do you see their kind of utility if the Chinese government decides to use that, or what potential is it to exploit that?
I'll hold up a little picture. We just launched a couple of weeks ago a really big online project. It was our sort of first go at doing great online, pretty great for a think tank, online visualizations, where we mapped out the global expansion of 12 Chinese companies, so all the telecommunications companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and some biotech companies. And we did that for a couple reasons. One was every day, because within our cyber centre, which is 15 people, we have a 5-person now China team who have Mandarin and who spend all of their time looking at China cyber tech and foreign interference issues. And every day we were getting media requests, including from quite a few from Sweden actually, saying, you know, what's Huawei doing in this country in Africa? What's ZTE doing here? What's Hikvision, the big surveillance company? What are their interests in Europe? And we just didn't have the data. And it's basically mostly not on the English, on English websites. Huawei is pretty good on their English sites of explaining what's going on where, but if you put those websites aside and look at their Chinese websites, there's a whole bunch of information that they'll only put in Mandarin. And a lot of the English websites, stuff's removed, deleted, you know, moved on. So you really need to, when you do this type of work, it has to be, a majority of it's in Mandarin. You can find out where offices are, let's say Huawei offices around the world. In English, that's easy. But when you're looking into a lot of detail about how they deploy smart city and public security solutions around the world, you have to really focus in on the Mandarin sites and on Chinese language media sources. So the Chinese language stuff is really important. And another problem is, you know, you don't have China's own media digging into these issues. US social media companies have many flaws. And the great thing about it is that you have a free US media who's digging into those flaws, and you have a lot of other newspapers who are holding them to account for what they're doing all around the world every day, and that's really important, and that's going to continue. You just don't have that in China. Chinese state media can't look into these companies, and they can't say, wow, you know, what CETC, for example, China Electronic Technology Group, one of their biggest defence SOEs, what they're unrolling in, you know, this country in Latin America has some problems. So we've tried to fill that gap a little bit by pulling, I think we now have, it says 17,000, 18,000 data points on here, 12 companies. And one of the really, we found there were many interesting things to come out of this project. One was smart cities. We had no idea how many smart cities were being built by some of these companies around the world. Huawei is the leader in this space. CETC and Hikvision are building some smart cities, but Huawei is building hundreds of smart cities around the world. In developing countries, essentially exclusively, they're funded by China Exim Bank loans to build out that smart city. Those smart cities focus a little bit less on the sort of city productivity side, efficiency side, like you would expect when I think of Singapore and smart cities. Of course, there's surveillance, but there's a lot of, we're making the city more efficient. The way that these Chinese companies are going at this is very much through a public security surveillance lens. So Huawei will often team up with a defense state-owned enterprise and roll out a huge series of cities. So Ecuador's a great example. Venezuela, I encourage you to go to the map, and I'll pass out links later. And essentially what happens is they'll link up the government departments, they'll deploy CCTV cameras, and there'll be a huge amount of surveillance combined with big data collection. The New York Times did a very big investigation a couple weeks ago on one of the big smart cities in Ecuador, where they got Ecuador's intelligence chief there, and he said, we don't have access to this data that's being collected. Minutes later, and this was a really incredible story, one of the New York Times film crew accidentally touched a button on the window where there was glazed glass, and that glazed glass went away, and behind that glazed glass was a huge room of monitors that was displaying data straight from this smart city. So there are a whole bunch of problems, obviously, with introducing public security heavily focused smart cities in developing countries where there's not always strong rule of law, there's not always strong governance. In some countries, there's been allegations that the political party in charge is using it to spy on the opposition. We found huge cases of corruption, not by the Chinese companies, often by the recipient governments moving around money. So that was one element of it. Another element that we looked at in this project is, and this is probably no surprise to everyone in this room, but where some of these companies are really cutting their teeth technology-wise, obviously, is China, and especially in Xinjiang. So a lot of these companies are deeply embedded with the public security apparatus in Xinjiang. Some of them work directly on the detention camps. A lot of them are running training with the police in Xinjiang. They're running data centers. Huawei does cloud provision services for the public security apparatus there. So you're seeing, a sort of basically an immense surveillance state and repression of Uyghurs and other ethnic groups there. And then what concerns us and why one of the reasons we did this project is, what does it mean when these companies go overseas and are taking those norms and values and that very heavy public security approach overseas? It means one thing when they come to Australia. We have a pretty decent rule of law. We like to change our prime ministers all the time, but the bureaucracy keeps kicking along, and we have a free media. And I'm sort of confident that when these companies come to Australia, we will debate that and figure that out. But when they're going into, say, in the Pacific Island region, where corruption is rife, rule of law is quite weak, and governance is very weak in some countries, that creates a whole host of problems. So this is a new project we just launched a couple of weeks ago, and we'll actually be working on it for a year, and we're going to add a whole bunch of other companies, probably focus more on artificial intelligence, surveillance and facial recognition from now on, to track that expansion and then to talk about the kinds of issues that come up as they expand.
Fantastic. I think that's a good talk of the tablet to end this on. If you haven't realized it by yet, of course, go into Australian Strategy Policy Institute, where you can find both the work of Danielle and Tom. Before giving a warm round of applause, I would just first make a little bit of PR for our next event on Friday. We have Anders Åslund coming and launching his book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, from Jail Press, which will be fun, and it's good. I'm in the middle of reading it. And then next week we have Henrik Sundbom launching the report on Russian interference in the European Parliament elections. The report is already out, but by then we will have the launch seminar. We'll also have a first impression discussion of what we saw in the European Parliament there. Confirmed panelist is Mikael Tovesson so far. So please join me in giving Danielle and Tom a warm applause. We also have a good speech. There you go.